Hello, beautiful community. Let's talk briefly, make this under 10 minutes, I hope, about Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine and what we can say in the context of Ukraine having and using ATACMS, what we can say about it politically. I think the first thing that's worth pointing out is that there is this extraordinary history of Ukraine getting stuff it needs with a delay of 3 to 6 months. And in particular, delay of 3 to 6 months from the point at which it would have been most impactful to receive that stuff it needs. To begin with, the overwhelming reason for this was nuclear escalation management. There is no doubt about that. But it'll be an interesting historical question. What political reasons for delays persisted over and above non-political reasons such as logistics and so on. And we're going to learn both about the delays and where along the chain of decision-making they were located. Retrospectively, we don't know clearly enough now. What we can say is that a certain point was reached when it became clear that giving a bit more and giving a bit more quickly wouldn't have dramatically changed the story around nuclear escalation management. In other words, it was clear that giving more and giving more sooner wasn't going to dramatically change the nuclear escalation picture. That's been clear for quite some months. That, of course, doesn't mean that we don't face very significant nuclear risk with this conflict, or that we don't face significant risk of this conflict escalating. We still absolutely do. But it seems that what we've learned is that at least for quite some time, going a bit more quickly wouldn't have dramatically changed the nuclear escalation picture. That's one point I wanted to make. I think there is something emotional worth saying here that I think makes a difference for some of you. Even though most of you probably feel fairly comfortable about it. And that is that from where we stand, we can feel relatively safe for now about Ukraine's survival, about Ukraine remaining a sovereign country. And we've got to be careful about saying things like that in a world that is to a good extent a world without a world order, that is a world in which a multiplicity of incompatible games are being played, such that each conflict we're viewing is a product of a series of games that big and medium powers are playing that aren't even directly involved in the conflict. That kind of fragmentation, which I hope to talk with you properly about in the next main channel video, that kind of fragmentation makes our world less predictable. But even allowing for that, we can say that we feel relatively safe from where we stand about Ukraine's survival. And if anything, it may be more likely that Putin starts a war against a NATO country before 2030 than it is that he manages to take Kyiv. But having said this positive thing about Ukrainian survival, what do we have to say about a Ukrainian victory? And you know my political analysis, and that is that the key commitment of the United States is to escalation management, not allowing the war to escalate and not allowing the war to escalate nuclearly, and to Ukraine's survival. The United States has never been committed to a Ukrainian victory. That's been something that was that's been thought of as a possible outcome, but not an outcome backed by genuine political will in the United States. What this point brings out is an important question that will become increasingly politically prescient in the West, and that is, if Ukraine's survival is safe, and if we're not going to put Ukraine in a position to win, and I'll say more about what that means. It's not clear what a Ukrainian victory means, but I'll say more about that in a second. But if we're not going to put Ukraine in a position to win, but we are putting Ukraine comfortably in a position of surviving, Does the space in between matter? Well, obviously it matters enormously to Ukrainians, and every inch of territory matters enormously to Ukrainians. But does it matter to the United States, and should it? Now, the argument will be heard increasingly that it doesn't make a difference. That 20 kilometers this way, 30 kilometers that way are only important if they swing Ukraine over from survival to victory. Unless they do, 20 kilometers is as good as 2 kilometers. It doesn't really matter. The problem we've got with logic like that is that there is a connection between Ukrainian progress on the battlefield and a political outcome in Moscow. Because unless Russia runs out of capacity permanently, because Russia could run out of capacity, take a break and start again. Unless Russia runs out of capacity permanently, this war doesn't stop until the Putin regime goes away. And indeed, if Ukraine manages to break Russia's land bridge to Crimea, to demilitarize Crimea, or even acquire Crimea, and the Putin regime survives this, the war isn't going to stop. Why should it stop? Putin will continue firing onto Ukrainian territory. So, given this, and this is far from the only consideration, but one thing worth saying is that stronger rather than weaker support for Ukraine, even if it all falls in between this pole of survival and that pole of victory, and without reaching the pole of victory, even if it falls in that middle ground, is significant and has significant but uncertain transformational power, just like the sanctions do. I mean, the sanctions don't stop Mr. Putin from carrying on the war effort, but they make life harder for him, and certainly also make it harder for him to start a second front, for example, and make that rather impossible. So putting Ukraine in a militarily more advantageous position creates bigger political problems for the Kremlin. And I just wanted to put that observation out there. I suppose a couple of micro observations worth making. One is that something like the current war effort seems sustainable for the Russians for quite a while. And another is around the question, what will it take for Ukraine to be in a position of trying a second offensive in 2024, having got through what's going to be a difficult winter, because Russians will be attacking critical infrastructure, and we know that some towns and cities are protected much better, but some much less so. But what will be Ukraine's capacity to try again in 2024? And at the moment, answers to that question do not look dramatically optimistic or dramatically convincing, even if Ukraine's survival is something we can feel very safe about. All of that we'll discuss in much more detail in the coming days and weeks. Lots of love for the moment.